Hi, this is our first lecture where we're going to start delving into the functions of the brain. Now, understand that I'm giving you an overview of these functions, that there are entire courses that learn in much more detail. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Now, when we look at the brain, we've already talked a little bit about its structure. We have the main part, which is the cerebrum, which is the bulk of the brain. The cerebrum makes up about 85% of the entire brain, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So you can see over here on our outline, and I'm not putting myself in the video today because this outline's pretty big. I know it looks like a lot. It is a lot, but it's an overview, and this might help you so you don't get lost as we go over the functions of the cerebrum. But before we jump into that, remember that the other areas of the brain, you have the cerebellum, which is the smaller lobe. It's posterior and inferior. This is the one that is very important for muscle coordination and balance. And if we look inside the brain, if we take that cap off, we have what's called the diencephalon, which has that thalamus, which you might remember had the third ventricle inside of it. There's a structure called the hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus. We're going to be learning about the midbrain. We'll be talking about the pons and the medulla oblongata. And remember that the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla all form the brain stem. Now, as we study the cerebrum, we're going to talk about the regions and landmarks. We'll talk about these hemispheres and lobes. But the first thing to understand is there's three regions of the cerebrum. The very deepest inside, like the inner core of the cerebrum, is called the basal nuclei. And we'll be looking at those basal nuclei a little bit later down here in our lecture today. We also know that there's an outer cortex, which is what we're going to focus a lot of time on. So notice under cerebral cortex, we'll talk about motor and sensory, association, language. So the cerebral cortex is very, very thin layer of gray matter around the outside. It's very thin. It's only about maybe 2 to 4 millimeters thick, but it does a lot of functions. And then there's also deep inside white matter. Remember, white matter is those myelinated fibers or myelinated axons. So as we study this, we'll be talking about the biggest piece will be on the cerebral cortex. We'll talk about the gray matter, and we'll talk about the white matter. So let's jump into the cerebrum now. In general, if we look at it, it has all these twisted worm-like structures. These are called gyri is plural, gyrus is singular. And it's all kind of folded and twisted in there. And what that does is it increases surface area. So you can pack a lot more neurons in there. In fact, if you were to take your brain out of your head and lay it out, the whole surface area is 2.5 feet, which is quite a bit of cells that you can fit in there. So the gyri are the worm-like convoluted ridges. The sulci or sulcus is singular. These are the grooves that you can see between the gyri. And so these are small grooves that are between the gyri. And then if you see the word fissure, a fissure is a larger, deeper groove between the gyri. Now, as we learn these, we're going to learn some names to help us study the brain. So one thing is the brain is going to have lobes, and you probably recognize the names of these lobes because they're pretty close to where the bones of the cranium were when you studied the bones of the skull. Now, on the brain, these lobes are separated by either a sulcus or a fissure. So the first thing is called the longitudinal fissure. Now, the longitudinal fissure is best seen in a superior view. So if you look at a superior view of the brain, you see this deep fissure. It's a pretty deep groove that runs right down the middle, like if you did a mid-sagittal cut. That's the longitudinal fissure, and that separates the brain. It separates the cerebrum into the right and left cerebral hemispheres. And you can't miss that when you look at the brains. Now, there's some other lobes that are separated that we need to understand. So the central sulcus is the groove, and it runs right here. I'll put it in this color. And so what you'll notice is that it actually separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Do you see that? That central sulcus. So that's the groove. It's kind of similar to where you'd expect to do a coronal cut or coronal, suture. And so it separates frontal from parietal. Now, just in front of it is a specific gyrus. So I'll color it blue here. And the one in front is called the precentral gyrus. So notice the precentral gyrus is on the frontal lobe. And that gyrus is going to function for motor. In fact, if I say somatic motor, hopefully you remember that that means it's going to skeletal muscles. And so you'll see shortly that there are neurons, there are cell bodies in this gyrus that send information to every skeletal muscle in your body. So the frontal lobe, this gyrus is motor. Now, if we look at the post-central gyrus, which is behind it, so I'll color that one green here, okay. The post-central, notice, is on the parietal lobe. And the post-central gyrus is going to function for our sense of touch. So it processes sensory information. So you have a pre and a post gyrus. You'll have to know their names. You can find them because you find the central sulcus. You'll see the gyrus in front and the gyrus behind. Now, the lateral sulcus is over on the side. You can see that over here. And that one is going to separate the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. So when you're looking for the lateral sulcus, look at a lateral view of the brain and you'll see that groove coming in here separating temporal from frontal and parietal. And the last one's pretty obvious. If we look at the parietal occipital sulcus, just what it sounds like, it's separating each parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So you need to know the lobes, and if you find the sulcus, that helps you figure out where a lobe starts or stops. So that covers our regions and landmarks. We've talked about some of the lobes. We're going to get a little more detailed now and look at the cerebral hemispheres. So as we mentioned, your cerebrum is divided into a right and left cerebral hemisphere. And what's interesting is that each of those receives sensory information and sends motor to the opposite side of the body. So for example, my right cerebral hemisphere is going to process and receive all sensory information from the left side of the body, and it's going to send out all motor to the left side of the body. So the information crosses so that each cerebral hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. And each hemisphere has slightly different functions. And so we call this cerebral lateralization. This is on page 445 of your book to 446. It's called a split brain. Now, first of all, it's not that you're right brain dominant or left brain dominant. Your whole brain works. I don't want you thinking that only one side of your brain works. However, because there's so much work to be done, your brain kind of designates work to different sides, different lobes. So generally speaking, the left hemisphere has to do with language for sure, speech, language, comprehension. It helps with sequencing. It helps with words and numbers. So sometimes we talk about the left brain as being more science and more math, whereas the right brain is going to be more involved with sensation, creativity. It also helps with spatial ability and recognition of people and places. So in this view, you can see again that we have the whole cerebrum, we have the two hemispheres, and how they're going to control opposite sides of the body. Now, the other thing I want you to know, though, is a little bit as far as functions of each lobe. So you saw the bones of the skull, and we'll be going into these in a little more detail, but generally speaking, I want you to understand what each lobe does. So you don't have to memorize, what percent of the brain is which lobe. Frontal lobe is the largest, but your frontal lobe is really like your thinking and your motor. So we already talked about that precentral gyrus on the frontal lobe. Remember, that's really important for controlling all skeletal movement. So it does all motor movement. It also does all our planning, our thinking, our higher level thoughts, processes. These are all going to happen in the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe, especially we'll talk in a minute about the executive functions, these take a while to form. In fact, they say that it's not fully developed till around 25 years of age. So you can look at some of the injuries associated with this and think about things that happen with maturity, like not understanding consequences or not understanding time. When we look at the parietal lobe, remember, is going to process information regarding touch. We already talked about that post-central gyrus there, so I'll draw that here. So we know it processes all information about sensation and touch, but we also know that it helps with spatial perception. So it helps us with perceiving shapes and spatial recognition, sizes and shapes. If we look at the temporal lobe, we'll go to that one next. That one, you won't forget hearing. Think about where your ear is, right? So it really helps with hearing and memory. It does help with understanding language and processing language. And it also has a structure in it called the amygdala, which we'll be looking at shortly. And the amygdala has to do with fear response. When we look at the occipital lobe, the main function of the occipital lobe is going to be vision and processing visual information. Now, some books you'll see a structure called the insula, and this is a small structure. It's deep to the temporal lobe, and they think that that helps process taste. So let's start with the cerebral cortex now. And you can see, if we look at the cerebral cortex, I mentioned it's a very thin layer. So you can see in green here, it kind of surrounds the outside of the brain. Think of it as the bark on the tree. It's very, very thin, but you can see it's critical. It has a lot of very, very important functions. And so generally speaking, anything associated with being conscious, being awake and alert, all your planning and thinking, all of your movement, all motor control, controls all your muscles, right? All memory. And it's gray matter. Since it's gray matter, we know it's composed of cell bodies, primarily lots of cell bodies of neurons. And then it does have a lot of interneurons as well. And these interneurons, though, remember, will be unmyelinated. Because remember, if they're gray, they don't have that thick myelin sheath on those. So let's start looking at these. We know there's 3 general kinds of areas. So you can see here in each lobe of the brain. And so we're going to have motor areas that we'll be talking about. You can see these kind of in green here on this picture. We'll be talking about sensory areas. You can see kind of the blue and the yellow and the red. And then there's something called association. And association is where everything gets put together for us. So in this picture, you can clearly see the precentral gyrus. So you see the central sulcus, and then you see the precentral gyrus. Well, the precentral gyrus, I told you, controls all skeletal muscles. Well, it contains what's called the primary motor cortex. So that gyrus, that whole piece there, is made up of a bunch of neurons, and it contains these cell bodies and interneurons. They're unmyelinated, and they control every skeletal muscle in the body. So somatic means that it's controlling voluntary structures. These are skeletal. So they've actually made this map of this gyrus, and you can actually see how many neurons or how much of that gyrus is spent on controlling, for example, muscles of the face and the hand. Well, there's a lot more intricate muscles that we use for nonverbal signals in our face and for dexterity in our hands than we need to actually control muscles in our knee. So there's, it's not evenly spread out. There is definitely more control over certain areas of our body. Think about the tongue, right, for speech. So what we have here, the neurons here are called pyramidal cells because the cell bodies kind of look like a pyramid. That's how they get that name. So those cell bodies are here, and they're going to send information to every skeletal muscle. Now, remember that off of the cell body is going to be the axons. And so we'll have all these cell bodies, and then the axons are going to leave. And when the axons leave, they form what are called pyramidal tracts. Remember, a tract is a cluster of myelinated fibers, basically. And so these tracts are all leaving and coming down through the brain. Now, these tracts are going to go down through the brain, and they're going to get to the medulla oblongata. And when they get to the medulla, that's where they cross over to the opposite side. So remember that my left, we'll look at this brain here, superior view. So all the neurons from the right primary motor cortex are going to go over and control the muscles on the left side of the body. And all of the neurons that are on the left cortex are going to go over and control muscles on the right side of the body. So they're going to cross over, and they go all the way down to the spinal cord. And then they synapse in the spinal cord at whatever level that muscle is. So it's going out to maybe your biceps brachii, it's going to synapse a lot higher in your cord than if it's trying to travel all the way down to your gastrocnemius muscle. And so these axons are going to go all the way down to the spinal cord, and they're going to synapse with the neurons. And the neurons there are called lower motor neurons. So when we're looking at the movement, at what actually controlled your skeletal muscles, in order for a skeletal muscle to contract, you need your upper motor neurons, from your brain and to go all the way down to your spinal cord. And then from there, they're going to synapse, and then they're going to send information out to the muscle through a lower motor neuron. And we talk about this soon when we talk about how we get information to our muscles, and we talk about motor tracks. So I want to introduce it here. Now there's also an area in front of, so we have our primary motor cortex. In front of that is an area called the premotor cortex. So it's thought that the neurons from the premotor cortex are going to stimulate the neurons in the primary motor cortex. So each neuron in the primary motor cortex, right, is going to go to a very specific muscle, whereas the premotor cortex controls groups of neurons. So the premotor cortex, we're still in the frontal lobe. It's located anterior to the primary motor cortex, and it functions for planning and coordinating muscle movement because the neurons here are going to stimulate groups of neurons in the primary motor cortex. So this is what's responsible for what we call muscle memory. So your brain, your neurons are going to automatically sync up this muscle memory. When you do a task over and over and over, you're forming neural pathways so that they can automatically trigger those muscles in just the right way so you can repeat the task without thinking about it. So one easy example is typing or texting. You know, when you were first doing it with your phone or your computer, it was hard. But as you get used to it, you don't even have to think about it. This is critical in sports. Think about any sport. You need some sort of muscle memory. I'll pick on basketball. If you're shooting a free throw, athletes do it the exact same way every time because they establish those neurons and those pathways, and that gives that muscle memory so they don't have to consciously think about it. Now, another thing we'll see here in the frontal lobe is called the frontal eye field. And the frontal eye field is just what it sounds like. It's going to control your eyes. So when you read and your eyes have to move back and forth across a page, this is what the frontal eye field does. So it's anterior to the primary motor cortex. It's in the frontal lobe. And, you know, when you learn how to read, one of the things you're doing is training the neurons so you can follow the words on a page. So those are our motor functions of the cerebral cortex. Let's come down and look at sensory. Now, when we look at sensory, we're going to start with our sense of touch. And again, we know that that post-central gyrus that we looked at in the parietal lobe is going to contain what's called our primary sensory area. You call it primary sensory cortex or area. It's also called the primary somatosensory cortex. They're all the same thing. Now you see a map again. You see this funny little map. Well, what this is showing us is the neurons that are set up, that are their job is to only receive information, sensory information like touch, pressure, temperature, pain from these areas of the body. And again, notice how much is dedicated to our face and our tongue and our hands. Is it really important that we can pick up sensory information from our leg or hip? A little bit, but not as important as our face and our hands. Think about everything we're using our hands for. So the neurons here receive very specific information from each area of the body, and they're mainly receiving information regarding touch. Now, these other areas here, so this is a nice overview of the brain. You can see, again, to review, frontal lobe, we're looking at a lot of motor stuff. Okay. When we're looking at the sensory areas, the parietal lobe is going to have all of our information for touch. Now, the other things we have are vision, auditory, olfaction, and gustatory. Now, we're going to examine these senses in our last chapter of the semester, but you need to understand which area of the brain functions. So we have what's called our primary visual cortex, and our primary visual cortex is in the occipital lobe, and it receives input from receptors located on the retina. You've probably heard of the retina before. So the retina responds to light, and when it's stimulated, it forms a nerve impulse, sends it out your optic nerve, which you might remember is cranial nerve number 2. And it goes to this area of the brain for processing. We have our primary auditory, right? We have hearing. So I think it's easy to remember hearing is in the temporal lobe, right? Think about where your ears are. And it receives input from something called the cochlea. You may know the cochlea is your receptor for hearing, for sound. And so that information comes in and it forms nerve impulses and then it gets processed. When we look at smell, smell is olfaction. That is also in the temporal lobe. So it's called a primary olfactory cortex. This is going to process information about smell. So it's going to get input from receptors. So they're just called olfactory receptors. And they are located high in your nasal cavity. So way up at the top of your nose. And these receptors are going to form a nerve impulse and they send them through axons that go into the brain. Well, those axons are cranial nerve 1, which is your olfactory nerve. And you might remember when you looked at the ethmoid bone that you had that cribriform plate. Remember that thing with all the holes in it? That's what these axons pass through. They actually go through the cribriform plate to come up into the brain. Now, when we look at taste, there's a few things about taste. This is showing taste in the parietal lobe, and you might see it in the parietal lobe, or you might see it as being described in the insula, which is that extra little lobe. And either one is fine with me because we don't really spend much time on the insula. But taste gets its information from taste receptors, which are in taste buds, which you've probably heard of before. So they form a nerve impulse and then they send that back to our primary gustatory area. So when we look at sensory, each sense is processed in a specific area, lobe of the brain. Now, the association's the more exciting stuff, and we'll just go over this briefly. I'm only giving you 3. There's more, but so the information comes in, but it has to be processed and put together. So the somatosensory association area, what that one's mainly going to do, and that tends to be right up here in the parietal lobe, is this is what integrates touch so that you can identify something that you touch. So if I asked you to let's say that you're driving down the road and you need to, well, you probably don't need to find a quarter or tolls anymore. They're all electronic. Let's say that you want to go to the vending machine and you need a couple quarters. So you reach in your purse or your pocket and you're feeling around to find a quarter. Say you had to find a quarter and a dime. You could touch those and you could tell which was the quarter and which was the dime without having to look. So that's our somatosensory association. Helps us identify things from their sense of touch. When we look at the parietal association, there's another area of the parietal lobe. This association area helps with spatial reasoning, perception, attention. It helps with speech and number processing. And this area also helps with skills in mathematics as well. If we look at Einstein's brain, they actually have it somewhere. They studied his parietal lobe and they found that his parietal lobe was a lot bigger than a typical brain. So the question is, was he born with a larger parietal lobe and that's why he was such a genius in math and spatial relationships and abstract thought? Or did he study that so much that the parietal lobe got bigger? I don't think anybody knows, but that's what we think of with parietal lobe. Now, the temporal lobe association area is really important with memory, especially any like personal memories or emotional memories that you might have. It helps recognize people and faces by looking at them. So if you see someone and you recognize who they are by their face, that's this area of your temporal lobe. And it also helps understanding language. And again, it processes some emotion as well. Now, if you hear agnosia, there's several ways. It's just what it means basically is it's an inability to recognize objects. Like that's the general definition of agnosia. So, excuse me, you could have a visual one where you can't recognize people or objects. You could have an auditory version, which would affect your temporal lobe, where you can't recognize sounds. Or somatosensory, again, we're looking at parietal lobe, that maybe you couldn't reach in your pocket and tell if it was a quarter or a dime. So the association areas are kind of interesting. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about language. So when we look at language, we're going to focus on 2 things. The ability to produce sound, like actually speak, which I'm having trouble with right now, and the ability to interpret sound. So Broca's area is our motor speech center. It's in the frontal lobe. It's usually on the left side of the frontal lobe. So most people have Broca's area in their left frontal lobe. If you're right-handed, it's in your left frontal lobe. If you're left-handed, it might still be there, but it could be in the right. And what Broca's area does is it helps us speak. It helps us form words and speak with a normal cadence, normal words. People who stutter might have trouble with Broca's area because they can't physically form the words as well. When you look at Wernicke's area, this is mainly interpretation. So if you're speaking to someone with damage here, they might not understand what you're saying. So it's being able to make sense of what's being said to you. So you can kind of think of Broca's as more the sending, right? Sending information out, and Wernicke's is receiving. And so we know that there can be damage to these areas, particularly with strokes. Stroke patients might have damage in certain areas, especially these. So when we're looking at Broca's area, they can't speak properly. They understand fine, but they can't form the words. If you've ever been speaking and the words on the tip of your tongue and you just can't get it out, that's Broca's area. So they can get frustrated. They know they're not saying the right word, but they can't form it. Wernicke's area, on the other hand, one is just being able to interpret language. So if you told someone with Wernicke's area, hi, hello, come in, sit here, they wouldn't be able to understand that. If you said sit, they could probably understand that or hear, but when you start putting words together, they can't put it together. Sometimes they can speak okay, but they speak nonsense. So they call it word salad because they're talking and the words are completely mixed up and they're not making any sense. And they usually don't know they're doing it. So unfortunately, a lot of times people just assume that they're like high or drunk, and that's why they're not making any sense. So just briefly about dyslexia, it's a bunch of different things that can happen with dyslexia. So we know it's an issue in the brain. The brain processes written information, spoken information differently than someone who does not have dyslexia. We know it can be genetic, that it tends to run in families. It's fairly common. And you can see that there's all different signs of dyslexia. And so there's things that can be done. There's ways to do different types of coding strategies, but it can be very, very frustrating when you have dyslexia. My son, who I mentioned earlier with the epilepsy and the migraines, has ADHD and dyslexia, and he has trouble when he's writing. He writes the wrong words, or he misses words, or when he reads even, he's leaving words out as he goes through. And if you have dyslexia, it can be frustrating. It has nothing to do with intelligence, not at all. For a while there, people assumed that you weren't as smart. Your intelligence is fine. Your brain just processes it a little bit differently, so you have to find other strategies to help learn the information. And then we have our executive function. So this is all in our frontal lobe, and this is our prefrontal lobe. So all the way in the front of the frontal lobe. And this is our major planning area of our brain. Our prefrontal cortex does what's called executive functions. Think of these as things that your brain grows into, right? Maturity, they'll develop these skills. These are the skills that they say are not developed until roughly 25 years of age. So cognitive thought, planning and predicting consequences, big one. Understanding time, right? Knowing you have 3 anatomy lectures to do and thinking, I'll do them all Sunday night at 10 p.m. It's not going to work, right? So understanding time management. So it's a major function. It does connect to other areas of the brain, and they think this is where worry and anxiety comes from. Your prefrontal cortex is overly thinking or thinking negative consequences, so it can generate the anxiety that can occur. But they know that it's definitely involved with planning and time and consequences. This is an area that they had done research on many years ago when there were serial killers. They started looking at their brains and doing testing on them. And they actually found that their brains had a very, very highly developed prefrontal cortex. So they were very aware of what they were doing and knew they were planning. And that's kind of what they enjoyed doing. Now, dementia is kind of a generic term that is going to mean basically it's a disorder in the brain. So you're starting to have issues with memory, reasoning, thinking. The number one cause of dementia is Alzheimer's, definitely, but you can have dementia from other causes. And so what you're going to notice is problems with memory. So they'll, maybe you forget things, you can't find things. It can progress to problems with understanding language and speaking. It can cause judgment issues. People with dementia, sometimes you'll hear about, what is it called? Is it the silver alert? When you get the alert about so-and-so's taken off in their car, we need to find them. Or they might wander off and not know where they are. And so it's just a slow, gradual decline in mental function. So we're going to go now to the gray matter. And as far as the gray matter, this is all the way deep, deep, deep inside the cerebrum. So the whole outside of the cerebrum, right, this whole outer area is the cerebral cortex that we've been focusing on. And now we're going to jump all the way to the deepest part. And this area has two things in it. So it's called the basal nuclei. You might see it called the basal ganglia. That's what it used to be called. Nuclei is the better word because remember, a nuclei is a cluster of cell bodies in the CNS, and that's exactly where this is. But it has this corpus striatum and something called the globus pallidus. Now, it's very small. This picture makes it look giant. It's about the size of a gumball, and it has many, many functions. One of the most important functions is it controls voluntary movement. So it's really important in inhibiting involuntary muscle movement. And it makes sure that when we're using our muscles, like if we're reaching for something or we're trying to use things with dexterity, it limits any excess muscle movement so we can have a smooth movement and helps fine tune our muscles. It kind of is like a system that can approve or reject signals from your brain for movement. So it can make sure that the correct signals get to your muscles so you can have normal muscle movement. They've also found lately, though, that it helps with learning, it helps with emotions and motivation, and even forming habits. It's kind of interesting for that one. And this is going to be affected by dopamine, which we'll talk about, and I believe in our next lecture. Now, the white matter is our last topic for today for the limbic, or excuse me, for the cerebrum. After this, we're going to move on to something called the limbic system that you'll see in your notes. But remember, white matter is going to be myelinated axons, and that's why this is all white matter. And what this mainly is are fibers, or we would just say tracts. So they're bundles of fibers, which means they're called a tract, and they're named according to the direction they send information. So a commissural fiber, or commissure, is a tract, and what it does, you can see it in blue down here, it relays information back and forth between the cerebral hemispheres. So it's a pretty busy tract. What we're going to see is something called the corpus callosum. You can see it here. And its job, it's white, is to relay information back and forth between the cerebral hemispheres. This is, these hemispheres are constantly talking to each other. If you reach into your pocket with your left hand, and I ask you to, again, pull a quarter out and tell me what you pulled out. Well, when you reach and you touch it with your left hand, that information goes up your cord, crosses over to your right cerebral cortex, and it goes over to your parietal area, so you know it's a quarter. Then it has to go back to your left cortex to Broca's area so you can say it's a quarter. So there's constant communication. And I read once that the corpus callosum has roughly 300 million axons sending 4 billion action potentials per second. It's crazy how much communication, right, is going on in our brains in this constant back and forth. So that's what a commissure is. An association fiber, that's going to relay information within one side of the brain. So it's usually relaying in one hemisphere or the other. So the association tracts are going to send information within one hemisphere. Maybe it's bouncing information around in the parietal lobe to connect all those different sensory areas. And then a projection fiber or a projection tract is just what it sounds like. These are going to run vertically. So what these are going to do is tie in the cerebrum with the rest of the brain and the spinal cord. So those are what our white matter does. So when we look at the cerebrum again, most of the focus is on the cortex, because that's our consciousness. And when we look at the cortex, it's divided up into different areas with very specific functions. So that concludes our lecture on the cerebrum.